Hi everyone, my name's James. I live in Sydney, Australia, and for the past sort of 3 years, I've been working on an add-on that myself and my partner Jeremy's actually listening to this. I don't know if he can talk, but he's actually on the other end of my Blender session, which we'll get into in a second. So he's my backup for today if things go wrong. So we presented at Blender conference last year, and essentially what we wanted to show people is we've invented a way of basically connecting Blender sessions together through the internet. So I'm at my house, Jeremy's at his, and we've actually connected our two Blender sessions together using our software plus a VPN. And the reason we did that is because I've only got one desktop machine at home, and it's not the fastest machine, but Jeremy's got like 2 or 3 machines at his house. So we found a way to connect them together so we can do renders faster. And I guess, my history with Blender, as far as my background was, I always wanted to learn stuff. I always used to really like doing tutorials, and I found I was always just running out of time because I would try something and render it to see what it looked like, and just found myself kind of frustrated that my rendering would take so long that by the time it sort of came up, I thought, it still doesn't look as good as the tutorial. I wonder what I've done. So I'd go digging around to try and find ways to fix it and then render it again. And I found just getting into Blender that way pretty hard. So I did a few projects with it, and always just came up against, it was really hard to get projects to work because of this whole trying to do preview renders and trying to get work finished. The reason we came up with this was trying to fix that, trying to get the computer to render really, really quick so that we could learn faster and get our projects done more quickly. And we presented that at Blender conference and people seemed to like it. So we set up a website and made the software available for download. So you can go to our website now and download the alpha and test it. And people have been giving us some really great feedback, including Andrew, which we're very grateful for that. He's been trying it out and giving us some very sound advice. The current alpha that you can download is a bit different to this one, which we're going to demonstrate, because part of the feedback that people are giving us is exactly that the software needs to give them more feedback. It needs to tell them what it's doing. Because obviously we wrote it, we know what it's doing. And I guess we didn't sort of think that other artists who are using it might sort of look at it and go, what the hell is this thing doing? It's not doing anything. When in actual fact it is, it's just that you don't see it. So the next version that's going to come out is going to have a lot more user feedback in, so that when you're setting up your Blender sessions and connecting, it's actually going to show you stuff. So I guess the plan for today was just to show you how it works at the moment, and then do a few quick demos with some very simple files, and then just talk about our development horizon and where we're going to go with it in the future. So hoping that all sounds cool and that everyone's keen to see this thing in action. Does that sound all right? All right, no one's raised their hand.
Sounds amazing.
Cool.
I'm serious. I really am intrigued by this, so let's see it,
Okay, cool. So over here on my screen, you can probably see, actually, can I move this? Yeah, let's just move that out of the way. All right, cool. So essentially, I'm going to go back to the very beginning here and just, because obviously I was testing this with Jeremy just before we started, and I'm kind of halfway through this. So it's an ordinary add-on. You install it like any others, and you just come in here and you click the enable button. And then once you've clicked the enable button, you should, all things being equal, get this new panel here called Crowdrender. And it sort of sits, normally it sits at the bottom of your render properties stack. So I put it up here just because I was sick of having to scroll to the bottom all the time. But most people, when they install it, they'll find that this panel sits, and I'm going to do the slow mouse thing all the way down here. So that's obviously for when you install it and you turn it on and you think, I can't see this magical Crowdrender panel. Where is it? Again, in the spirit of good feedback, it'll probably be at the bottom of all of those other panels. So please don't think it hasn't worked. Just scroll to the bottom, it should be there. So it adds this new little panel, and you'll notice some familiar controls. So you'll notice there's a button for doing renders that are still, for doing animations. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff. This part is kind of where we're doing a bit more development. So the current alpha that you can download from our website doesn't have this new bit here, where you can actually add new machines and you can get rid of old ones. What I mean by that, I'll explain in a minute. But essentially what I've done here is, you'll see this part called second machine. So what I've done here is I've added what we kind of call a render node or a render slave. If you've ever used like a render farm, that terminology might be familiar to you. If you're not, it basically means some other computer other than the one that I'm working on that I've connected to that's going to help me render this scene. And that's Jeremy's computer. Now, he's all the way over in another suburb of Sydney. He's probably about 10 kilometers away from me, and we've connected our networks together just using an off-the-shelf VPN software, which I won't bore you with the technical details, but what it means is we're able to actually connect my computer to his just using an ordinary internet connection and this VPN software, which is pretty cool. We did this for the first time last week, and we're able to do a render my house to his house using his machine at his house and my machine at my house. So that was pretty exciting because we'd never managed to do that before. I always had to go around to his house and take my laptop and all my other equipment and plug it into his network and do it there. Whereas now we can just sit in the comfort of our own home and do it remotely, which is a lot better. So essentially what I did was I added this machine, and I've called it Jiggy because that's the name of his computer actually. He calls his own computer that. And then I just go over here and I hit the connect button. It's already connected. And pretty much what that does is it allows me to now just do things like this. So I can actually just do a quick render. So this image actually is partly rendered on my machine, partly rendered on his, but you can't tell because our software stitches it back together and plugs it back into Blender as a render result. Now, initially you might think, well, you know, that isn't that amazing, but I think sort of the problem that we're trying to solve meant that we needed to do things like this. So let's just say, you know, you've done that render and you weren't particularly happy with it and you want to develop the scene a bit more. Now, normally what happens if you make changes and you're using like a render farm or you've connected machines together, you've got to upload the whole blend file a second time so that the changes are in there. But what we did is we built a system where you can actually make changes. Like I can change the size of the cube. I can do that in real time, and then, well, fingers crossed, because this is a live test. There you go. So I didn't have to upload a file or do anything for me to be able to change the size of that cube and then re-render it. We built a system which basically streams tiny little edits from my computer that's sitting here in my house over to Jeremy's computer at his house. And it automatically syncs my edits so that I can hit render pretty much straight after doing any kind of edit, and it will start working on the scene and rendering it straight away. And I guess this helps with doing the development of artwork, because this was the part that I always got stuck with. I'd want to make little changes, little tweaks to a scene, and then re-render them quite quickly, which was tedious with the machine I had. And then I found that render farm solutions, they wanted me to upload the whole file every single time I wanted to do a render and use a render farm, which wasn't really going to work for doing iterative work because I had to upload sometimes quite large files and wait, and then it would get in a queue, and then it would take ages for the queue to clear, and then my one little frame would get rendered and it would get sent back to me. This method, I think, is a lot better for doing sort of rapid iteration of, you know, your final tuning before you commit to a render farm, because you can do all this kind of crazy stuff. You know, you can move stuff around, do something a bit more interesting, like add. Any of these have a material on? Well, this one does. Let's change the color of the material. See if that works.
We've got a question. If you could write up the URL for this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you can again.
All right, cool. So let's just try that. So we're just going to do another render. And for performance, typically what we found doing this is, oh, look, yay. Oh, I'm so relieved when this works. I shouldn't be surprised, but you know what? We've had quite a few technical gremlins this afternoon just trying to get this to work. So in terms of performance, two machines, that's pretty much what you expect. It's when you get the scene right, it's about twice as fast, or it takes half the amount of time to render. The new version we're working on at the moment takes the restriction off the current release in the alpha, where the current release only supports two machines. We're working hard on a version which supports as many machines as you dare connect to it. We might still limit that to a handful just for testing how this thing scales, because you wouldn't want to sort of, you know, go for like 20 machines and then find out that it takes a long time for the uploads. Even though the uploads are quite small, there is a bit of latency every time you add a new machine. So yeah, performance should scale linearly. So if you had 3 machines, you'll find that your renders will take about a third as long. Again, it depends on what's actually in your scene. So there's a lot of technical stuff that we're trying to work on to make it much more easier to predict the performance lift. Okay, so what I want to show you is, all right, cool. I just need to find where these files are. Excellent. Okay, so what I am going to do is I'm going to go back to Blender real quick, and I am going to open a couple of images. So what I need to do is I need to go to my users. So forgive me just ambling around for a second. I just really want to show you what each machine actually renders, so you can get an idea of how to optimize performance for this, because it does actually make a difference what each machine is actually rendering, as you might imagine. I think from memory, the number for this one was 7D7. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to open up one of these images. So this is an image that Jeremy's machine just down the road did while we were talking. All right, cool. So what this shows you is that Jeremy's machine did the right-hand side of the screen. And what we're working on at the moment is a way to better load balance machines, because at the moment it's kind of naive. It just splits the machines based on the number of cores relative each machine has. So mine has 4, his has 4, which means the split is pretty much even. What we're working on next is working out how to detect where the actual complexity in the scene is, so that split will move depending on where objects in the scene are rendered or not. So you can imagine if you had the default scene where there's just one cube right in the middle, if your split doesn't line exactly up with it, then one machine will have more effort or more work to do than the other, and you won't finish at the same time, and you end up with a situation that is less optimal than you might otherwise have. So if I just go back into Blender, if I was to change the camera, so now you'll see that Jeremy's side of the computer has got a lot more stuff in it, because he's rendering this obviously the right-hand side. Sorry, I've got to remember slow mouse cursors. So because Jeremy's machine's now going to have this cube to render, and my machine's basically going to have a bit of the plane, mostly the background, his machine's going to finish faster. So generally what we've found, this early alpha version that's out there for release works really well when you've got scenes which are more sort of like, move the camera back, more like this, which basically means you've got most of the scene is filled. There's not much background, and it's pretty much even both sides of the screen, the complexity. So you've got objects pretty much occupying the whole frame. That will give you a very optimized, balanced render in Crowdrender, and you'll get pretty much the halving of render time with 2 machines. Now, this gets sort of less and less of an issue the more machines we add. So when we start going into adding more machines, it's going to be less of a problem. But we're also looking at ways to optimize just the 2 machine case, because we've talked to a lot of artists, and some people, they only have 2 machines, or they only have 1, and they might have another friend somewhere on the internet that they could set up a VPN solution with and actually share their machines. So that's pretty much, I guess. Sorry, I can hear someone coughing in the background. Our kids have been sick all of last night, so I'm kind of operating on not much sleep and a lot of adrenaline and coffee.
You can write an add-on for that too, right?
Yeah, I think so. So pretty much that's the basic use of it. So I guess one of the things we wanted to let people know is you use Blender pretty much as normal. So, let's just say you're into the later stages of tweaking your scene, and you might be sort of doing things like, moving the camera around like this. So just make sure everything's still synced properly. Well, I might have to ask Jeremy to restart his machine. Looks like it might have gone offline. The whole sort of ethos of how we built this was to get to the stage where, users don't really notice that our add-on is there, apart from when they do renders things really quick. Because we didn't want to have people constantly coming here and having to manage stuff. And that's part of the development that we're doing now, is to try and make it a lot more automated. You might notice if you download the alpha right now, it'll support some edits fluidly. Other edits will cause what we call a sync failure, which means you've got to just press a button to resync the machines again. And that just naively transfers the Blender file again. Obviously, that's not ideal because if you've got a large Blender file, you've got to transfer it to each machine. So the idea eventually is to support pretty much any kind of edit you can do in Blender, so that you just use Blender as normal. You know, you model, you put your textures in, you do your animation, keyframes, whatnot, and then you can pretty much just do this final tweaking phase using whatever machines that you've got available to you, and not really notice that you've got this add-on there, apart from the fact that it's making things a lot quicker. So where we're at now is obviously, obviously this demo is showing some things which are quite basic. We've done a few more advanced things. So you may have heard of, actually, I'll see if I can type this in. I'm just going to put in the URL if I can. So just one moment. Exit full screen. We're working with, I think Oliver Vijara is going to be on later today. He's got a film called Luke's Escape. He's been working on for a few years, and we've been working with him to try and get that to the stage where we can use it with Crowdrender. And we've managed to render a few frames with it. So I actually want to put the URL in there so people can see what that looks like. So let me just search for it. This is probably the one. So let's have a look at that. I won't actually play it, but the URL will come up and you can see it. I'll just press the share button, and then you guys will be able to see the URL, and I'll leave it on the screen for a couple of seconds, but I'll pause the video because it's probably a little bit crazy to try and stream from YouTube through Zoom. I don't think anyone will probably enjoy me doing that.
So you've been working with Oliver on this?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to leave the URL there, and people can copy that down if they want.
Perfect.
If they want to go and just check out the teaser. So we were working on just one of the scenes, because Oliver sort of saw our demo video, which is also on our website if you want to check it out, and thought, wow, that's interesting. And he was really supportive of the idea, and he sort of gave us one of his scenes to see if we could render some of it. And so we were able to do that with Crowdrender. Obviously, we had to do a few hacks because the current alpha version which we used, it doesn't support yet external libraries out of the box. You can get it to work, but there are ways of doing it. You just have to know where to put certain files. So where all the external libraries have to go, you just need to know where to put them. And you can support scenes like we've got here in Luke's Escape, which this is a fairly complicated scene. It's got a lot of detail in it. It uses cycles. It uses a number of different layers, so it's a multi-layered render. And there's compositing. So it took on my laptop, I think, about 33 hours for one frame. And that's pretty much all I had in terms of hardware at home. So it was clear from the start that we needed to be able to accelerate this somehow. So we managed to hook that up using Crowdrender and share it across two computers. And I think we got a reduction of about 50%, because Luke's Escape, as you can see from this scene here, it meets the criteria for getting the most out of Crowdrender. The scene is completely full. There's pretty much even complexity across the scene, more or less. There's no background, no large sections of background showing through like they are in the default cube scene. There's a lot of objects everywhere. So typically we found that most scenes we tried to render with this using just two machines would, as long as the machines were equally capable in terms of their CPUs, it would halve the render time per frame. And we were still able to move the camera around and then render straight away, so we didn't have to do any file transfers for that, which was amazing because the file size is like closing in on a gigabyte. So you can imagine working with this file in sort of close to the end of your production scene, and if you're using a cluster of computers to help you do that, every time you want to do a preview of what is going to go to the render from and you want to just do a quick render, you'd be looking at like a gig upload to all of your machines. Whereas with Crowdrender, it was just almost instantaneous, because moving the camera around in Crowdrender costs you less than a kilobyte per machine. So it's very fast to do sort of those late stage tweaks and edits using Crowdrender, and get pretty fast turnarounds on trying to do sort of those tuning renders to make sure that everything's good before you commit it to, sending it to a render farm where you might, obviously if you're doing a production shot for a commercial project, you might be using a commercial paid render farm, or if you're using something like Sheepit, you know, you want to make sure that your file's completely bug-free before you submit it, because well, once you get it back, if there's errors in it, you'll have to re-render those frames, and it'll be quite frustrating. And hence, you know, why we sort of built a system that could do this, so that we could quickly do test renders of batches of frames and make sure they were fine before committing them to a proper render farm. So yeah, I mean, working with Oliver has been great. He's been obviously very supportive, because I mean, we want to help him finish the film if we can. Obviously, you know, that's contingent on us being able to develop the software to a level where it's actually ready for, you know, this kind of high-end work. And we're working towards that. So that's one of our development goals. And I think, you know, it's going to benefit the community if people can sort of look at short films like this and think, okay, you know, Crowdrender can actually support that level of work. Obviously, when we do demonstrations, we're not the best artists per se. You know, obviously, we do very simple demonstrations because, you know, I've been using Blender since about 2009, and I guess I still class myself as kind of a beginner/intermediate, and it's one of my goals to actually learn Blender to the level that I see in, you know, films like Luke's Escape and other sort of high-end tutorials and work that I see out there. It's just very hard to do it when you don't have a really fast, powerful computer to test new techniques on. So that's kind of sort of status quo of where we are today. And, you know, we've got a lot of things planned for the future. So that's probably, you know, it's probably good to sort of talk at this stage now about, you know, what are we going to do next? You know, obviously, the version of software we're working on right now, which is still an alpha, but it's going to be a much improved alpha, because the one that we initially released was just quite naive. Just we put it out there because we wanted to get feedback, because we thought we've got to the stage where we can't really give ourselves any feedback now. It's kind of out to the artist community, and obviously we released it, and they instantly started finding all of these little problems that we hadn't spotted or didn't notice, it was good. It made us feel a little bit embarrassed sometimes, though. Particularly the one about, hey, this thing doesn't give you any feedback, and I'm hitting the connect button to try and connect another machine to it, and nothing is happening. That kind of stuff, I guess we hadn't picked up on because we knew what it was doing. So the next version that's coming out, hopefully, so the next couple of weeks, has a couple of goals in it. Number one is supporting Linux, which we've been testing with a few members of the Linux community. So we handed out a few Linux builds to some other people, because we ourselves are not Linux experts, so we didn't really want to be the people that tested it and said it was okay. We wanted other people to test it first. So a few people put their hands up to test the Linux version, which so far they've been able to get it to work, which is great. The other big change, which I'll just go back to Blender, is in this area. So this is kind of a new interface which is under development, and the aim of that interface is obviously to provide feedback. So you'll notice if you've downloaded the other alpha that, you know, this panel doesn't exist in there. It's actually just pretty much this and a button that says connect, and there's no real feedback that comes back to the user when they're going through the process of connecting to another machine or rendering or getting it to synchronize with large files. So this interface has a little animated icon, which tells you how far through a connection process you are. It'll also do other things like tell you the status of the machine in pretty much near real time. And once we start adding more machines, this is pretty much a standard kind of design in Blender for a UI of dealing with many things of the same type. So you'll pretty much be able to add machines by hitting, you know, this plus button, and you'll be able to expand this, and you'll see other machines in here. And each of them will have a little status symbol and also some text just telling you what they're doing, so that you'll know what's happening. So that's been a pretty big upgrade to the system just to do that. On top of that is obviously supporting more than 2 machines connected at once. So the next version will be probably, I think we're going for like 4 or 5, just to try that out, because obviously, you know, we don't want to sort of give people the ability to connect to hundreds when they don't have hundreds of computers available to them for the first place. And also we want to sort of test how the system behaves when we start to add more and more machines to it. So after we've done Linux and the new interface and the multi-machine build, the next versions are going to look at supporting complex projects like Luke's Escape. There's a lot of complexity in those projects, in that the fact they have all these external files, and you've got to track all those external files, make sure that they're the most up-to-date version that the artist is working with, because the artist can change those. They can change texture files, they can change external Blender libraries, and we need to keep in sync with that and make sure that the actual final scene that they're rendering reflects the latest version of their work. So that's going to be a pretty big change. That'll be more towards probably mid-year, we think. The version that we're working on now, which has Linux support and the new interface for connecting things, which is here, and multi-machine is probably hopefully before the end of the month, maybe a little bit into April. Depends on our testing. We're doing a lot more testing now because we realized that our test environment is just one environment, and users have a lot more. So
some people are asking, how can they help you test, or what's a way to talk to you, to get in touch with you?
Yeah, get in touch with us through the website. We've got, basically you can just either sign up and post in the forum. That's all free. You just register for an account. There's also a contact form on there, or another way you can do it. You can just give us an email at info@crowdrender.com.au. So that's our general just get in contact with us address. Yeah, so that works. We've had about 147 people, I think, to date become site members, which gives you the ability to download the software and also post in the forum. And I think, all up, we've had about sort of 200-ish people actually interact with us in some way through the website. So that seems to be working okay. People post. We try and get back to people as fast as we can. Obviously, we're pretty busy. Both me and Jeremy, obviously, we work full-time pretty much outside of Crowdrender, and so we do this sort of weekends and evenings. But we've managed to get back to most people within sort of 12 to 24 hours of them making a post. And that's purely because we're in Australia. Most people tend to be in Europe or America, so they're either posting while we're asleep, or they're asleep while we're reading their posts and getting back to them. So generally you can expect to see between a 12 and 24-hour turnaround. Yeah, I can see Andrew smiling. It's just the nature of the beast. It's where we live, Although it makes for a good setup for Crowdrender, because if we can make friends with a lot of people in America, we can use your computers while you're asleep and you can use ours while I was asleep. They'll work out. Yeah. So sadly, yeah, we can't sort of get the continents to line up. I think continental drifts put a permanent stop to that. So cool. So yeah, look, we love talking to people. I think back in 2015, towards sort of October-ish, we started just reaching out to artists and asking them, is this useful, was our first question. Because myself, a bit about my background, other than Crowdrender, I used to be a flight simulator software engineer. So I used to program those clunky big computers on hydraulic stilts where the pilots sit in, and sometimes get seasick if you don't do your coding very well. It's actually the #1 complaint from pilots of those particular systems, that if we'd screwed up something somewhere in the system, they would all feel like vomiting. Yeah, it was quite funny. Well, funny for us anyway. We never got seasick.
A friend from Perth says that Australia is drifting north anyways. And someone was asking about data use. Do you have any idea, like data use between computers, etc.?
Oh yeah, this is how it works. It's tiny once you've uploaded the file the first time, and that depends on how far through your work is. So if you start with the default file, just the default scene when you open Blender, that's about 400 kilobytes. It'll transfer that to every single node. So that's like 400 kilobytes per machine you're connected to. After that, you're talking sub-kilobyte for every change, because every change you make is tiny. It's just basically the change between the scene a moment ago and then what you did to it. So it's very, very small, and it has to be, because essentially what we're going for is, if I was to sum up, what do you want to achieve with Crowdrender? It's to get to the point where people can fluidly share computing resources in real time, so that you can you can get as close as you can to like art is with paper. Disclaimer, I'm not the world's greatest paper artist either. Like, you know, oils, crayon, I'm just hopeless generally with art, but I'm quite good at programming. We had this kind of mission that if we could get it close, if we could get like using Blender close-ish to using like a paintbrush work, because you know when you use a paintbrush, the moment that you make a stroke, you can see what's happened in front of you. But for us, when we were trying to learn techniques in Blender, the equivalent of that is, you know, we'd start a render, which is the equivalent of making the brush on the canvas, and it could be 5, 10, 20 minutes before you'd see what you'd done. It just make it quite hard to visualize, you know, how do I develop my work? So I guess, yeah, the data use had to be small so that we could rapidly update those computers so that they'd be ready to render really, really quickly. So you can expect to see, you know, very little in terms of bandwidth usage, unless you're doing a lot of changes to things like textures. If you're putting a lot of textures in and then changing them a lot, then your bandwidth will be pretty much whatever the size of the textures is multiplied by the number of machines that you're using. And that's because there's no real way to, if you're putting lots of new textures in all the time, there's no way for us to do anything else but to transfer that, because it's not data that you can duplicate. If it's a mesh and you make lots of changes to a mesh, that's pretty easy because all of those changes are basically just commands in Blender, which are easily ported to another session somewhere else. But a texture, there's no way you can run a command that reproduces a picture you've taken with your DSLR camera. So the whole texture has got to go through the internet to the other machine. Having said that, once that texture's there, the great thing about, you know, our system is it's not re-uploading that along with everything else each time you make a change to where the camera is. I mean, that was one of the big problems that we faced with Crowdrender at the outset when we were trying to use like render farms, is every time we made a change, the whole file had to go. You know, textures and all. We hadn't changed the textures. We just like changed where the camera was looking because we didn't like the first shot that we tried. And it was just, I guess, a bit painful having to use all that bandwidth again, when really all we needed to do is send just a tiny change to say, just move the camera. Forget all the textures. They haven't changed. Just change this part of the data set. So yeah, hopefully, sorry about the long-winded answer. Yeah, the bandwidth is low, and that's by design. All right, cool. So maybe we can talk about, there have been some other questions that artists have asked us, and they're mainly along the lines of, apart from Linux support, but GPU support as well. So we put up some videos on YouTube about how to use this system, and then we had a lot of people saying, what about GPU support? What about GPU support? So we thought that's something we've got to look at. There's like an official answer, and then there's a cheeky sort of unofficial answer, and I'm going to go with a sort of cheeky unofficial answer. It's similar to using the complicated files. Yes, you can do it. And you can do it right now with the alpha, but it involves knowing what you're doing. I was actually quite surprised because we've been working on Crowdrender to do just the basic CPU renders with cycles and Blender internal, which it's both compatible with, so you can use either. And we thought one day, because we'd managed to get hold of a lab full of computers at my university, which all had GPU cards, and we thought, just for fun, why don't we just set them all to use the GPUs and then set Crowdrender going and see if it'll actually do it. We thought it would chuck an error or do something hideous or just sit there and do nothing. And it actually rendered, and it actually did yield a significant time saving. I think, you know, it rendered something that would have taken about 3 minutes, 20 seconds, and we got it down to about 2 minutes and about 2 minutes, 30 seconds. So it wasn't a straight in half, but then again, the scene was kind of not exactly filled. So we kind of sort of reasoned that the reason for it not being exactly half was because one card was slightly faster than the other, and that the scene wasn't completely filled with detail. So the unofficial cheeky answer is, for GPUs, yes, you can use them with Crowdrender, you can share them, but there are a couple of caveats because you need to kind of know what you're doing to get it to work reasonably well. Number one is our code, the alpha that you can currently download, it splits the screen based on CPU cores. So number one requirement for using GPUs, you've got to have 2 GPU cards, which are pretty much the same. And then you also have to have 2 CPUs, which have the same number of cores. And then you'll get a good splitting based on the relative power between the cards, because if both of the cards are the same and both of the CPUs are the same, then the image will be split 50-50, and that's appropriate for that setup. If you've got, you know, two CPUs that are the same and one GPU card is way faster, that's not going to be optimal. It'll still work, it just won't be optimal. Likewise, if you've got two GPU cards which are the same, but one CPU's got twice as many cores, it'll still work, but it won't be optimal. And us being engineers and pedantic like that, we like things to be efficient and optimal. It's kind of something we drive into our software. I mean, again, you know, I used to work with flight simulators, so we had to be efficient because things have to run at 60 hertz on those machines. And if they don't, like I said, pilots start throwing up and shouting at you, because they were all military guys. They got quite grumpy if they got seasick, as you can imagine most people would do. So yeah, with the GPU thing, number one, be mindful of the scene, what's in it, and the relative computational ability of the cards and the CPUs. Second thing to think about is, how do you set this up? You've actually got to make sure on your system settings that you've saved the compute device as a GPU, not the CPU. You've got to save it in system preferences. If you just set it and then you don't save the system preferences, it won't work, because it basically, when our system comes along and engages with your scene, it's going to use whatever is in system preferences to render. So if you haven't saved it as GPU, it'll use whatever was currently there before, which is usually just the CPU. So just to recap, if you want to try this, make sure you've got two computers which are as much as you can identical in their CPU and GPUs, and also make sure that you save both machines that you want to use as using the GPU as the device in your user preferences. And it should work. I mean, we got it to work in a lab, and it was fairly robust and reliable. Again, it's a direction we want to go in for future support, where we actually make it far more user friendly. Again, you know, software engineers are not renowned for being people that make user friendly software. That's usually more the role of the user experience designer or something, to come along and teach us all a lesson about how human beings actually behave. Because apparently we have no idea.
It's okay. Yeah. We still love you.
Thanks, guys. We appreciate that. We appreciate everyone being patient with us. So that's part of the future direction. So just to recap, you know, we're looking at complex scenes which have external dependencies. We're looking at GPU, and we're also looking at numerous improvements to the system overall, in terms of how does it determine how to split scenes up, looking at different ways of splitting a session across different machines. So for example, at the moment we do tile-based rendering. There's no reason why our system can't be adjusted to do splitting frames up between different machines. And you know, if you're doing animations, which our system currently does using tile-based rendering, it's possible that doing splitting frames between machines rather than splitting tiles per frame might be faster. And certainly, you know, another direction we want to go in is driving the viewport through cycles, or through, I think you guys had Brian Savory on tonight. Has he already been on?
No, he's much later.
He's much later. Okay. So I chatted to him about using RenderMan, and we actually got RenderMan to work with Crowdrender as well. That's not in the current alpha. That's an experimental build. But it's another direction we want to go in, and it's supporting external renderers, so not just the cycles or the Blender internal. But we've done tests and proved that Crowdrender will work with RenderMan, which it was pretty cool. That was another sort of, wow, that's awesome moment when we got it to do just a simple single frame in RenderMan. So that's pretty much the future direction for what we want to do. And we want to support pretty much this.
Oh, sorry, I was a little delayed. Andrew was asking about the limitations, caching, etc.
We talked about this before, actually. So I'm glad he brought that up. Let's just do limitations generally. We'll start off with caching, because that's a good one. So what I will say is, I've had a lot of problems with caching, full stop, let alone trying to split it across machines. So I would say at this point, there's an official and then there's a cheeky unofficial answer. The official answer is, yeah, it probably doesn't, the alpha probably doesn't support it yet, and we'll have to do some more work in a later release to properly support doing caching of, you know, point cache and animation with particles. The cheeky unofficial answer is if you can get caching to work so that you can load your Blender file from scratch and then run an animation render without having to rerun the simulation, if you can do that consistently, then it will work with Crowdrender, because that's pretty much what we do. We open your file up and we just run a render straight from the file, unless you're making changes to it. And obviously those changes are what we talked about with the streamed edits. You know, you saw me earlier on moving the camera and the cube around and doing different renders. So if you can get your file to work by just opening it and doing a render straight away, and you can select whatever frame you want, and you can get the cache to behave itself, and that's consistent no matter what machine you open it on, then the cheeky unofficial answer is yes, it will support your caching, and you can do your animation with, you know, soft bodies, cloth, particles, whatnot. The caveat and the reason why the unofficial answer is it doesn't support it is because I've tried doing that so many times, and I've always had issues with caching just mucking up for some reason. And normally what I do is if I'm going to do a render, I just start from scratch, not load caches from file, and I just redo the simulation. And so what that would imply for Crowdrender is we would have to code it so that Crowdrender, and you know, it can do this, we just haven't gone to the detail of doing it yet because we've got 1,001 things we want to do. It would open the file, rerun the simulation from scratch, making sure the cache was clear, and then start rendering. You know, I don't like that very much because it means that each machine that joins in the renders has to basically do the simulation. Each machine has to do it itself. So you'd have kind of like this idle time where all those machines are doing a simulation prior to starting the render. It's much more efficient if you can generate a cache and that gets uploaded, because it's just done once on your machine and then it's uploaded to the nodes and it doesn't have to be rerun. And so if you think about the whole network in that situation, the whole network is preoccupied only with rendering. So it's much more efficient from, you know, power to bandwidth and all the rest of it. Or maybe not bandwidth. Certainly from power and from CPU consumption, it's more efficient. I dare say it's probably more a limitation with the cache system at the moment, or maybe it's just my inability to get it to behave itself. Like I said, you know, I'm not a super expert at Blender at the moment, so perhaps with a few tutorials and training, I could be able to get the cache to behave. But that's pretty much the word on the limitation with caching. But there are other limitations as well, which we've kind of touched upon throughout this presentation. Certainly getting the most efficiency out of the computers that you've got able to render. We talked about making sure the scene is evenly filled, because obviously if you've got one half of the screen completely background and the other half is filled with complex objects that have to render, that's probably the least efficient mode to drive your renders in through Crowdrender, because one machine will basically do nothing and then be finished, and the other will be lumped with doing all of the rendering. That's a limitation which we're working on, where we can actually detect that for you and split the screen in the right place so that both machines have exactly the right amount of work to do. So that's an important limitation to be aware of about, you know, your framing of your scene. If you've framed it so that you've got one part of the image background and the other part is all models, then you're probably better off, if that's what the shot's going to be, just using the normal Cycles or Blender internal renderers. Because Crowdrender won't really accelerate it in its current state as far as the alpha is concerned. But future development's hopefully going to put a stop to that. So, you know, even if you have scenes which have a bias one side to the other or top to bottom as to where the complexity is, it'll still be able to detect that and appropriately divide up the effort. It's all about just choosing the right tile sizings, or splitting frames up, whole frames over machines instead, which completely circumvents that problem. So in the future, we might offer you a tweak where if you have a scene which is more heavily biased towards, you know, any part of the screen, you can just choose to split frames up over machines instead, which then obviously would, if you're doing an animation, that helps in the sense that, you know, it doesn't matter anymore where stuff is in the screen. You'll definitely get a speed boost out of it.
So I like to ask this question, because again, you know, this might be years by the time someone sees this again, and they might be kind of curious. What's something that, like, as someone is setting this up, they're probably going to run into this problem, but what would you recommend to fix? Like, what are some common things that seem to break, or or whatever, and some common troubleshooting things to
Oh,
fix
absolutely. Yeah, so I'm just going to turn the light on because it's getting dark here. Common things that people tend to sort of run afoul of is, firstly, connecting. If they're using, this involves networks. Networks are notorious for causing all kinds of issues. It's probably one of the more difficult disciplines in software engineering to get right. Not wanting to make it too simple. My dad was a lawnmower mechanic, and he would have a lot of people coming to him for very sort of simple problems like there's no fuel in the tank. We ourselves have come across situations where, you know, our network card was off or not working. So when you're using a system which splits things up over a network, first you've got to do just basic checks like, is my network on? Is my router working? Do I have an IP address? And you can do that. So if I come back to one of the things that we've built into this interface, which I'm going to leave in here, is this thing called network connections. So if you open that up, it'll actually show you whether you've got active network connections. If your network is not connected, there'll be nothing in here. And that's a sign that you need to shut down and start again. There'll be a few changes to this panel, but essentially this is going to stay open just to sort of let people know, you know, you've got I've got two networks connected in this case. That's usually the thing which like gets us sometimes is, yeah, network's just not connected. Other things, gosh, I'm thinking what else could be happening. I mean, most of the other problems are probably happening because the software's at an early stage of development. So feedback that we have got where people are just going like, I can't get this thing to connect. And that's usually the problem, is just getting past that. I can't get it to connect. Once you're connected, most people seem to find that everything works fine. So troubleshooting connections is usually around, number one, is the network operating, like we've said. Number two, in the current build, because it doesn't give you any feedback at the moment, which we're working on in the next release, a lot of people think that, oh, it's broken. And so they hit the connect button again, which is, it's fine. You know, our software doesn't suffer from that. But because they're not seeing anything happen, they get frustrated with it. I think then they just abandon it thinking it's not working. So we're trying to sort of fix that in this build. But yeah, pretty much the troubleshooting advice at the moment is just around make sure that your networks are active, make sure you can ping other machines as well, because you can sometimes have a network connection, but for one reason or another, the network is not allowing like my computer to reach Jeremy's computer, for example. So one of the things that we do before we actually start Crowdrender up is we make sure that my machine can ping his. Now that's probably, it might be a bit of tech speak to some people as to what does that mean? What does pinging mean? Pinging is just a command that you do in like a terminal or a DOS prompt. You know, I can give you a quick demo of it just on Windows if anyone is serious about doing this, because it's a very useful command to have. So in Windows, you just do that, and then I'm going to ping Jeremy's machine, which I've connected to. 0. Actually, what number is he at? I'm just going to find out. Oh, no, that didn't do it. 53. Sorry, it just came up in the other window. Awesome. So he's at 53. And if he's still there, which he might not have been, request timed out, that would explain it. So there you go. The reason I can't connect to his machine is because I've entered the wrong ping in. That's why.
I was going to say,
should be
that's
actually
why you're
168. Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. I've been rather quiet all night. There we go. So that little test on Windows machine, if you ping the right address, see, I actually pinged the wrong, if I can mark this. That was the wrong address. That's the right address. And obviously the wrong address got me this, you know, request timed out. So if you were setting up something and you saw request timed out when you do a ping, stop right there, because Crowdrender is certainly not going to work. So that's one of the gotchas straight away, is you might have the network set up, you might have an IP address, and your friend's computer might, but if the ping doesn't work, pretty much nothing else will. That's fairly reliable on local networks. If you start to do stuff over the internet, unless you're using a VPN, like me and Jeremy are using a VPN today, so pinging is still fine over a VPN. But if you're pinging over the internet, a lot of internet servers like Google, they stop pings from hitting them. So depending on what you're pinging, if you're adventurous and you want to get out there and just start pinging away at things, you might find that you get no request, but that's because there was something called the ping of death, which hackers used to do, which would bring down systems. They would just get a whole bunch of computers to gang up on a server and just hit it with ping requests. So nowadays, a lot of routers which are on the internet don't accept the ping request anymore. But through local network, things still work. So to recap, most of the issues that Crowdrender is going to have are pretty much around just being able to reach the other machine. And you can, like just demonstrating using the ping command, if you can ping it with Crowdrender, usually you can connect to it. The obvious things which sometimes we've got wrong is the fact that Blender isn't open and Crowdrender isn't enabled on the other machine. That's another one that sort of stung us before, which seems, again, a bit funny, but that can also happen. You've got to have the other session open and listening, and make sure that you put the right address in. We've had a number of issues where we think people have put the wrong IP address in, because you notice that I pinged Jeremy on his IP address here, which is that's his address on his network. Normally that's what you would enter into our interface here. It's kind of easy if you get disoriented the first time you use Crowdrender to think that the other machine is actually one of these two and try putting that in. And obviously that doesn't work because that's your machine, not the other machine. We're making this now a lot less dependent on IP addresses. So the next iteration that comes out is going to use this interface where you can actually use the host name in the machine. So Jeremy's called his computer Jiggy. And so all you have to do now is type in Jiggy and then hit the connect button. And it will actually automatically find his IP address, as you can see down here. If I go back down to this window, like all I did was put in Jiggy, as you can see. Actually, I'll mark this whole line. And it found his IP address automatically. So that's a lot better for artists because you can, I think you can easily find your computer name. It's sometimes a bit difficult to find your IP address unless you know where to look for it. Also, if your network card or Wi-Fi card in your computer breaks and you go and replace it with another one, there's a good chance that your computer's going to get a different IP address. And then when you type what you thought is the right address in to connect to that machine again, it won't work because that IP address no longer exists. But the host name isn't going to change unless you change it. So this method is a little bit more robust. Well, that's pretty much it in terms of, I think, troubleshooting. Mainly revolves around just making sure Blender is open, Crowdrender is running on both machines, and that you can reach the other machine on the network. We've been doing tests now for a couple of years, and as long as you satisfy those criteria, generally you can get a session to happen. You can render. Yeah, and obviously the usual applies. I make sure that the versions of Blender and Crowdrender are the same. That also helps because I think unlike Blender, it does matter on which version of Crowdrender you're using at the moment because we're changing stuff so often that we just can't guarantee that version 0.1.1 will work for version 0.1.2. So it's better just to upgrade everything.
No problem. Well, man, this has been fantastic. Thank you for the whole session.
No problem. Thanks, guys, for having us, and thanks for helping us demo this live over the internet. It was wonderful, but if you'd have been in my house like 20 minutes before we started, you would have probably not wanted to know. That was a big stress bunny because we tried to sort of fire up a Linux version of this and demonstrate it, but unfortunately it couldn't find my webcam. There was a whole bunch of other problems, like the VPN client didn't work, so we just went back to using good old Windows and Macintosh. But yeah, it was awesome. Thanks, guys, and over to you, Andrew, and cool.